Welcome. It's Joseph here at Career Movement. I'm a senior recruiter and sourcing manager for our office. I work primarily with hiring managers and decision makers, and I also spend a lot of time speaking with candidates across multiple sectors, including tech, finance, accounting, legal, just to name a few. But one thing that I see over and over again is that when recruiting becomes frustrating, when it feels inefficient, or when it feels like it's not producing results, and it should, most people assume that the issue is the market, whether it's on the candidate side or the client side. Not enough not enough roles, not enough good candidates. They assume that there's just not good candidates available, or that people aren't motivated, or that expectations have changed too much based on a variety of factors. Everybody wants remote roles, right after COVID. Right now, everybody's going back to office in some type of hybrid environment at the very least. In reality, most of the time, the issue isn't effort. It isn't a lack of talent. It's a lack of alignment. Early on, alignment around expectations, priorities, timing, and communication are absolutely critical. And in this episode, I want to break down what recruiters actually do, where they can add value, and how hiring managers and candidates can work with recruiters in a way that leads to better outcomes on both sides. I think one of the biggest reasons recruiting is misunderstood is because people think of it as a transactional process. There's an open role, a recruiter posts it, candidates apply, resumes get sent in. But in reality, that's not how things work. Granted, I will say some recruiting firms do that. We here at Career Movement do not. But really, the way to effectively go through a recruitment process is to fully understand how things work. And the best way that I can explain it is to compare recruiting to real estate. A recruiter functions more like a realtor than a job board, right? If you think about a realtor, but they don't show you every house if you're one type of buyer, right? They're not going to show me $10 million homes in Malibu all the way going up to 50. That's not my market. I'm not buying that. So they're not going to waste their time. They don't schedule those tours for me. They know I'm not qualified, and they don't try to push me into buying that type of home because, one, I can't afford it. But what they actually are asking is, what do I actually want before they're going to show me anything? And a realtor spent that time understanding my budget, my timeline, priorities, and my non-negotiables, right? They help buyers understand trade-offs, and they help sellers understand how the market actually responds to their listing. Recruiting is the same thing, right? On the hiring manager side, we're working to understand not just the job description, but why the role exists, what problem is meant to solve, and what success actually looks like in the position. On the candidate side, we're trying to understand what someone is good at, what motivates them, what they're actually looking for next, and really not just what it says on their resume. And just like a realtor, a recruiter's job isn't to make every deal happen. It's to prevent bad deals that look good on paper but don't work in reality, right? A realtor is going to advise their client to accept offers that they know are actually going to be approved by that buyer's lender. They're not necessarily going to go for the risky buyer unless that's their only option, right? Same thing in recruiting. That's why good recruiters are not sending every single resume to their client, and they don't present every candidate. They're filtering intentionally because alignment matters more than volume. When recruitment feels broken, it's often because filtering and alignment didn't happen early enough in the process. Once you understand recruiting through that lens, it becomes easier to see where recruiters actually add value to hiring managers, because the job isn't just to fill a seat. The job is to help a company make the right hire at the right time and for the right reasons. Most hiring managers come into a conversation with a job description, and that's the starting point, but it's rarely the full picture. Honestly, most of the time, there's only 2 or 3 must-haves in a actual company-written job description, and most of the time, candidates filter themselves out even though they would be qualified. However, sometimes those filters and what's actually needed are the critical component of trying to find somebody, and it can make things somewhat difficult on certain searches. One thing that recruiters actually should be doing is asking questions that go beyond a document, right? It's not just what are your requirements. It's questions like, why does this role exist? What changed? What problem is this person expected to solve in their first to 12 months? What does their outlook look like after that? Those questions matter because a role that exists due to growth is very different than one that exists due to turnover or reorganization, even if the titles are the exact same. Another big part of the recruiter's role is pressure testing requirement. A lot of job descriptions are aspirational. They list everything somebody could possibly want, not what the role actually needs to be successful. A lot of the times you're going to use 2 of those tools that are requirements, and the other 3 requirements are just going to stay there. When that happens, good recruiters are able to really understand and push back on hiring managers, and not to be difficult, but to make sure that the role is hireable in the current market. We'll often see situations where a hiring manager is frustrated that they're not seeing strong candidates, but once we dig in, we realize the requirements don't line up with the urgency or the budget or even with the work the person will actually be doing day to day. I've also had it where a requirement that wasn't really listed in an actual job description was the one and only factor that truly mattered. Obviously, you're not going to get the right candidates from just a job description and an ad, but we have to do that search. Whether that skill is available at the current salary that that particular client is asking for, that's a different question, or at the technical skill set that that person needs to have. That's where alignment becomes critical, because if expectations aren't clear initially, it's almost impossible to attract the right external candidates. Recruiters also play a big role in screening for motivation, which is something that's hard to assess from a resume alone. 2 candidates can have very similar backgrounds, but completely different reasons for wanting the role. One might be genuinely interested in the work and the environment, while the other is just trying to leave a situation that they're unhappy with. That difference matters. Part of our job as good recruiters is to understand those motivators, to communicate them to the hiring manager so the decisions aren't made on skills alone. Again, candidates also have to understand that on the other side. Is that environment going to put them in the best place for them at that right time? A lot of times, the job and the skill set align. However, the environment isn't necessarily the right place for a particular candidate, depending on what's going on in their lives. All things that both sides have to take into account as they go through a hiring process. There's also a lot of value in communication that happens behind the scenes. Recruiters are often managing candidate expectations, providing feedback, and keeping processes moving so that good candidates don't disengage. Hiring managers don't see that work, but they feel the impact when the process runs smoothly and offers are accepted without necessary friction. Again, not always the case, but I have had it where after a final interview, a candidate didn't hear back for 3 weeks. Throughout those 3 weeks, I was constantly talking to them, checking in and giving them a sneak peek behind the curtain of what was going on with that particular client and why their expectations on timing were going to be delayed a little bit. That allowed the candidate to understand, okay, I'm still in the running for this role. There's things happening that need to be cleared. And after those 3 weeks, they actually offered him the job. He took it. But understanding that communication is critical throughout the entire hiring process is something that both candidates and in particular hiring managers have to understand as well. When recruiting works well, it feels easier than it should. And that usually means alignment happened early on in the process. One of the reasons alignment matters so much is because the cost of getting a hiring wrong is almost never limited to just one person and one role. When a hire doesn't work out, most people think about the obvious costs: time spent interviewing, onboarding, starting the process again. However, that's really not the entire picture. There's bigger costs that are less visible to most others. A misalignment hire affects the team around them. It creates extra work, slows momentum, and often puts attention away from other priorities. Managers end up spending time course correcting instead of leading, constantly training, constantly repeating, doing other people's work. It all adds up in what the job is and what everybody else around it has to do. And even when someone technically has the skills to do the job, misalignment around expectations can still cause problems. We see this when somebody joins a role expecting one thing and the reality looks very different. That disconnect leads to frustration on both sides and in many cases, a shortened tenure. And it's something that as good recruiters, we try to prevent. If a client tells me that a candidate left before a year, for here in career movement, we're going to be a little bit upset about that. We are looking for those candidates that are going to be long-term hires for our clients. That is something that we pride ourselves in terms of understanding the culture, the environment, and putting the right person in the right seat at the right time. Another hidden cost is dragging the process. When recruiting takes longer than it should, or when decisions are delayed because expectations aren't clear, strong candidates often disengage. Those candidates don't always tell you that they've lost interest. They just quietly accept another offer. They stay in their current role where they are, and that's it. And from the outside, it can look like they're just not good enough candidates, when in reality, the process itself became a barrier of entry for that particular role. This is where recruiters add value by identifying potential issues early before they turn into missed hires or costly resets. Sometimes that means slowing down things in the beginning so that better questions are asked, alignments are correct, and other times it means helping hiring managers recognize where internal alignment is missing. This is especially critical when there's more than one decision maker. In the long run, that upfront clarity saves more time and effort than rushing forward without it. When recruiting feels inefficient or unpredictable, it's often a sign that alignment doesn't happen early enough, not that the market is broken. One of the biggest contributors to misalignment in recruitment is a lack of transparency, and that applies to both candidates and clients. Earlier, I mentioned the realtor analogy, and it applies here as well. A realtor can't do their job effectively if a buyer isn't clear about their budget, timeline, or non-negotiables, like I said earlier, right? The same thing is true in recruiting. Why would a realtor show you an open floor plan when you specifically asked for something completely blocked off? They won't, right? A recruiter is not going to show you those types of roles either. When candidates withhold information or when hiring managers are vague about priorities, it limits how effective a recruiter can be, not because the recruiter lacks effort, but because they lack context. So, funnily enough, I had this situation pop up 2 days ago where a hiring manager said, hey, send me a resume for this type of candidate. And I sent him a resume of a candidate that we represent. His response said, hey, this person not senior enough for what I'm looking for. I had zero information. I just had a job description, and I sent him another candidate that was more of the higher level he was seeking. However, the entire deal was lost just because we weren't able to align appropriately before he saw a resume. We're not resume senders. I hate sending a resume unless I know what the role really is. And if you're a good recruiter, if you're working with a good recruiter, that's what you should really be emphasizing in your communication to align all expectations appropriately from the start. From a candidate's perspective, there's often a fear that being too honest will hurt their chances, that if they share their constraints, preferences, or concerns, they'll be screened out. In reality, transparency usually has the opposite effect. It allows us as recruiters to position candidates more accurately and advocate for them effectively. Plenty of times we've had hiring managers say this candidate is not good in XYZ. However, context that was provided to us by the candidate when we talked to them initially in our conversations allowed us to really have their back and advocate for them, fight the hiring manager, which ultimately can lead to interviews and potential hires. People have definitely been hired where the initial resume reviewed by a hiring manager was initially a just pass. If a recruiter understands what motivates somebody, what they care about, and what trade-offs they're willing to make, they have much more productive conversations with hiring managers on that candidate's behalf. For hiring managers, transparency is just as important. Again, I emphasized it a little bit earlier, but when priorities aren't clear internally, it shows up in the process. When they're not clear initially, it shows up in the process. Candidates sense uncertainty in roles after speaking to you. Feedback becomes inconsistent. Decisions take longer than they need to. The lack of clarity can create friction even when there's strong interest on both sides of the table. Now, recruiters sit in the middle of those conversations, and our ability to manage expectations depends entirely on how much information we're given. The more context we have about goals, constraints, priorities, the better we can guide both sides towards decisions that make sense long-term for both parties. Transparency doesn't guarantee a perfect outcome, however. It significantly increases the odds of alignment, but it's not a perfect method, like nothing is. And alignment is what turns a hire into a successful one instead of a short-term fix. One thing I want to be clear about is that standing out in a hiring process usually has very little to do with having a perfect resume. Resumes matter, but they're just the starting point. What really separates a strong candidate is how they can clearly tell their story. If you're getting a phone call from me or any recruiter, your resume has done its job. All it's doing is getting you a phone call in that initial screening. Talk to them. Tell that person who you're talking to about yourself, your story, what you're good at, what really makes you tick. Because that stuff that's not on the resume is what gets you hired. Resumes are just a piece of paper with some words on it. You are a human. You have the skill set. The paper does not. So please, please, please understand a resume is there to get you an initial phone call. That is it. That also doesn't mean rehearsing a pitch. It means being able to articulate why you've made moves you've made, what you've learned along the way, and what you're actually looking for next. When candidates struggle in interviews, it's often not because they lack skill, it's because they can't clearly connect their experiences to the role in front of them. From a hiring manager's perspective, clarity builds confidence. When someone understands their own values, their direction, as well as understanding how to reduce uncertainty around their own candidacy, it clarifies any question a manager may have. Consistency also matters. Candidates who communicate one thing on their resume, something slightly different on a screening call, and something else on an interview create unnecessary doubt. That often means answers need to be rigid. It means they need the underlying narrative to make that make sense. Again, you're just trying to make your life, your experiences, and what you're good at and how you can provide value to a company make sense to the person in front of you. Another thing that stands out is realism. Strong candidates understand that every role involves trade-offs. They're thoughtful about what matters most to them and what they're flexible on. That level of self-awareness makes it much easier for recruiters to advocate for them and for hiring managers to assess fit beyond just technical ability. At the end of the day, the candidate who stands out are the ones that make it easy to understand why this role at this company makes sense for them right now. It's also important to talk honestly about the limits of what recruiters can control. Recruiters don't create roles. We don't make final hiring decisions. We can't change a company culture, and we can't force alignment where it doesn't exist. What we can do, however, is surface those issues early, ask questions that might not otherwise get asked, and help both sides make informed decisions. At the end of the day, we are an agent, we sit in the middle, and both sides of the table have to have the most information to make the right decision for themselves. In the perfect scenario, both candidate and client love each other and they see a future together and they actually fulfill that long term. But you can only make the decision that you have with the information that you have. So trying to get as much information by asking questions that wouldn't normally are critical to any hiring process. Sometimes that does mean pushing back on a job requirement. That doesn't make sense. Sometimes that makes a benefit negotiation the pushback. Things have to align. Other times it just means honest with the candidate or client about why the role may not be a fit or why the candidate may not be a fit, even though on the surface everything looks great. Those conversations aren't always easy, but they are necessary. If a recruiter never challenges assumptions, never pushes for clarity, and never says no, they're probably not protecting either side of the table. Good recruiting isn't about forcing outcomes. It's about reducing the risk and increasing the likelihood that when a hire happens, it lasts. Again, goes back to what I mentioned earlier in I want all of my clients to have candidates that accepted offers to be there long-term, ideally more than 2 years at the minimum. And that's why alignment and transparency matter so much throughout the entire interview process. So if you're watching this, you probably know that last year we started putting out some videos for both candidates and clients to just see what's out there in the market, both from a job perspective as well as candidates. But this video podcast series that we're going to be doing and putting out every once in a while is meant to be a resource for people who care about making better hiring decisions and more informed career moves. In future episodes, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into specific markets, roles, including tech, finance, legal, accounting, and we'll also be talking about trends that we're seeing from both candidates and the hiring side here at Career Movement. Obviously a little bit more boutique in terms of what we do, but we'll be sharing those reference tools like our upcoming salary guides to help provide context around the market. Those are meant to inform conversations, not replace them. Better hiring starts with better understanding, and that's what we're focused on here. Like the video, hit subscribe, and click on the notification bell to get an update when we post our next video.